Hey, hi, folks. My name's Maureen Yap, and I'm a senior counsel at the National Fair Housing Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us for the discussion of the advocate comment letter on the request for information on the use of artificial intelligence. So now I'm going to kick it over to our CEO, Lisa Rice.
Thank you so much, Maureen. Hello, and welcome to this webinar covering the key elements of a joint response to the federal regulators' request for information on the use of artificial intelligence by financial institutions. A team of fair housing, fair lending, civil rights, data scientists, engineers, and technologists collaborated to prepare what is a very comprehensive, detailed comment to submit to the federal regulators who are seeking information about how to best provide oversight in the use of artificial intelligence in our financial system. While AI systems are being increasingly used in our society and impacting every element of our lives, the public's understanding of these tools is really quite limited. Yet technological advancements are fast-paced, especially during this time of the COVID pandemic, when our reliance on technological tools has drastically increased. So it's imperative that the civil rights and consumer protection community, the public, and all who are impacted by these technologies have a voice in how they are developed, utilized, and monitored. And that's why we wanted to convene this session today. Our goal is to provide an overview of some of the complex technical issues that are covered in the joint response. We want to answer as many of your questions as we possibly can today and provide you with information so that you can follow up with our team in case we aren't able to get to all of your questions. The joint response is open to all of your organizations in case you'd like to sign on, and we hope that you do. And because there's so many of us on the session today, we won't take time to go through introductions. We wanted to devote as much time as we possibly could to the material in the response. So we'll begin with Steve Hayes of the Relman Colfax Law Firm, who will provide a background and overview of key issues related to the use of AI in financial services. We'll then pivot to Michael Akinwumi, who heads up NAFA's Tech Equity Initiative, to talk about data issues and outcome risks. Following Michael will be Kareem Saleh and John Merrill of Fair Play AI, who will talk about model risks. And then Olga Axelrod of the ACLU and Maureen Yap, NAFA's senior counsel, will go over the recommendations and explain to you how you can sign on to the response. And then we'll open it up for questions. Again, thank you all so very much for joining us today. And now, Steve, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you, Lisa. Thanks everyone for joining. If we could just start at slide 4, actually. So one of the key points in the letter is that artificial intelligence and machine learning, which is a variation of artificial intelligence, is rapidly becoming pervasive in financial services. So these models are being used for credit scoring and pricing, for advertising, for automated valuations, and they carry serious risks. They're not inherently good or bad, this type of model, but they do carry risks if those risks are not guarded against. And one of the themes of the letter is that today there have been some agency signals about AI, ML, but they focus too much on encouraging innovation and not enough on ensuring safe, non-discriminatory use of these models. So if we move to the next slide, slide 5, I'll do a little bit of an overview about what we're talking about. So what is a model? As folks on the call probably know, a model is basically just something that is taking some data, oftentimes historic data, and using that to make predictions. And obviously models have been used in financial services for a long time. An ML model is a little bit different because it doesn't require modelers to specify relationships between the variables or the data going into the model and then the outcome. At a high level, what that means is it can be a little bit more difficult to understand why the models are reaching the decisions that they're reaching. Because of that, that can cause additional problems. So these models can perpetuate inequality in certain ways. And we'll talk about how that might happen. I want to distinguish also the concept of the models themselves from the data going into the model. So for a long time in financial services, traditional data, I'll use the word traditional data, which has generally been used to mean data that you'd find in the files of the nationwide credit reporting agencies. So trade line information, what type of credit has someone had before? How have they performed on that credit? How long have they had that credit? That type of data has for a long time been used in models to make decisions about creditworthiness, for example. Alternative data is really a catch-all umbrella term to mean almost anything else. And it can range from things like utility or rent payments all the way to social media use and behavior on social media. And as you can imagine, there's a huge range and variation within that term, alternative data, in terms of the risks that the use of that data can raise. And so some of those risks include proxying for a protected class, driving disparate impact. Some of that data might be inaccurate or incomplete in ways that is even more significant than traditional data. So I want to distinguish those two terms, alternative data and any type of data going into the model, and then the model itself. So this is sort of the groundwork that we'll now start to talk about the problems that these things can raise. So if we move to the next slide, here for AI ML models, there are lots of risks in terms of how these models can perpetuate discrimination. I've got three broad categories here. The first is that data can be unrepresentative. So for example, if you are training a model, if you're developing a model, and you have one slide back up was, if you have too few properties or too few certain types of borrowers as you're training the model, then when you try to use that model on those populations, it may not work very well. And that can be a real issue with models. The second broad category is variables themselves can reflect historic discrimination. So you can imagine a situation where we have a history of predatory lending and reverse redlining in certain communities, particularly communities of color. So those communities of color have been targeted for loans that are designed to fail, and you're going to end up with higher failure rates there. If you use that historic data to then train models and continue to risk tier people based on that data, you're going to be embedding that historic discrimination. And there's many ways that that can happen. We'll talk in more detail about how it might manifest. But that's another key risk that we're focused on in the letter. And then the third major category is lack of diversity among developers. So model developers, there are diversity problems there. Oftentimes they skew predominantly men. There's a lack of people of color, particularly African Americans and because of that, there are blind spots in terms of developing these models. So every model requires some human judgment. And in terms of when these models are being developed, if you don't have diversity with respect to modelers, you're going to end up with blind spots and miss key points as the models are being developed. That can then exacerbate discrimination. So if we move to the next slide, the legal framework that's relevant here for the comment letter include the Equal Credit Opportunity Act and the Fair Housing Act, which I'm sure folks are very familiar with. Those prohibit discrimination in credit and in housing, including mortgage discrimination. This third category here is probably something that people are a little bit less familiar with, model risk management. And what this refers to is a set of agency expectations. So expectations of agencies like the OCC, the Federal Reserve Board, and the FDIC. These are expectations about model use. And these have been around for several years now. They're really focused on risks that models can raise with respect to financial risk. So safety and soundness risk, making sure that your models are accurate, because if they're not, that might actually lead to potential safety and soundness issues for the financial system. So these model risk management principles are really sort of model health principles. Are your models accurate? Are they going to work in different periods of time? Will they work during a recession just as well as they'll work during an economic boom? Are you monitoring how your models work? Are you documenting what's going into your model? So this is model health. Now, it has not historically been about discrimination. It is focused, as I said, on financial risk. So another key point of the letter that we'll come back to is marrying these concepts up, understanding that this type of model health principles have to also take into account risks of discrimination. Those two things should go hand in hand. The only risks are not just financial risks, you have serious discrimination risks, and model health should take that into account. So move to the next slide, please. The discrimination principles we talk about, I'm sure folks on the call are familiar with disparate treatment, which is intentional discrimination, and disparate impact. In the model context, disparate treatment generally means using protected class or proxies for protected class directly as variables in a model. Disparate impact doesn't require any proof that anyone intended to discriminate. And it doesn't require showing that a protected class was used in a model. And in fact, disparate impact can and often does exist despite inclusion of protected class or proxies in a model. So if we move to the next slide, disparate impact is a three-step framework, as folks are probably familiar with. And you can see how this manifests, especially as we consider that historic data encodes historic discrimination. And so it's likely to cause disparate impact. The first step of disparate impact is, does the model result in disproportionate negative outcomes for a protected group? So for a credit model, that might mean are denial rates for Black applicants significantly higher than denial rates for white applicants. That doesn't necessarily mean it's in the illegal model, but that does signal a problem. We then move to step two. Does the model advance a legitimate business interest? And here in the credit context, you can imagine a model might want to predict the likelihood of default, which would be a legitimate business interest because it's in everyone's interest not to extend credit to a group of folks who are likely to default on that credit. Now, many other models, it might be a closer case, whether they're actually predicting something legitimate. Even if it is, though, the third step, and if we can move to the next slide, this third step is really, I think, a key point for the comment letter. If the model is causing disparities, even if the goal is legitimate, and even if it's accurate, are there some changes that could be made to the model that would decrease those disparities and still serve that interest? And as we point out in the letter, we think that institutions using models should routinely be looking for and adopting these less discriminatory alternative versions of those models. And agencies have a real role in pushing institutions to do that. So as agencies are supervising institutions, agencies should be looking for those less discriminatory models as well. That's another key theme in the letter. And so you'll see these repeated again and again. And so I'll turn it now to Michael to talk a little bit more in depth on the risks that we address related to models in the letter.
Yeah, thank you, Steve, for that excellent background. And if you could please move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so one key takeaway, similar, following up on what Steve mentioned, is that traditionally the focus when it comes to like even fair lending or assessment of risks associated with models that are used in financial industry. So the traditional focus is usually on the outcome, right? And our approach here is actually not to create a separation between safety and soundness principles and also fair lending, but rather we try to actually have a holistic view of what the associated risks are. So when it comes to use of AI or machine learning in financial services, so there are actually three core components. So the data, the outcome, or the prediction, and also the model, where the model here actually refers to the algorithm itself. And that's why we strongly believe that when it comes to understanding risks that are associated with AI, one also needs to understand risks that are related to the data being used, the predictions or outcome coming from the AI models, and risks that are related to the model itself. And in the next couple of slides, I'll be focusing on risks that are related to the data and outcome. And then the next speaker will focus on model risk. Okay, so if, as human, if you could imagine that, okay, we've never seen humans with horns before, right? The same way we would actually struggle if peradventure we come across a human that actually has a horn, because that pattern has never been represented in what we traditionally known to be human. So the same thing applies to the representation of people of color in the data that is actually being used to develop these AI or machine learning products and services. So historically, we know that people of color, they are underrepresented in credit and mortgage data. And unmitigated use of those data in AI or machine learning model would actually exacerbate or amplify the bias that is actually against these the people of color. Can you please go to the next slide? And another bias that we highlight in the comment letter is what we call a sample bias. So on the previous slide, I mentioned that there is historic discrimination against people of color. Now, when you think of the application pool for, let's say, credit, what we know is that low-income communities, they have like fringe financial market where they actually access their data, right? And if the model itself, like AI models, are based on data that is coming from the mainstream financial services, so you could imagine that when it comes to those that are actually rejected, this particular group will also not be represented in the accepted pool of applicants. And what happens is that machine learning models traditionally, they focus on the accepted pool of applicants, and the true credit worthiness, for example, of those that are in the rejected pool, they are never known. So we call attention of stakeholders to look into how the rejected pool of applicants, the data on those rejected pool of applicants, could actually be used to mitigate any bias that may be related to data being used in the AI or machine learning models. Next slide, please. So like Steve actually mentioned in the background, one of the background slides, so one additional rate that could be related to data is use of proxies, right? So AI is very good when it comes to discovering patterns that are actually not even obvious to humans, right? So like Steve mentioned, you don't even need to specify what the interactions or the between the variables are. Because AI is very good at that. But one possible problem with that is what we call the proxy problem, because some of the patterns could actually be proxies for protected class. The common ones are zip code or number of divorce, which could even be a proxy for religion, or even phone area code. But the more obvious ones are, for example, length of hairstyle, right? Or even high color. They could all be proxies, even if model developers are saying there is a legitimate reason for using some of these variables or some of these proxies. But what we know is that these could be proxies for protected class, and there needs to be a way to actually investigate and make sure that such proxies are not being used in the models. Next slide, please. So a common class of, there are broadly 3 classes of AI or machine learning models. And a common class of such models that is being used in financial services is what is called supervised learning. And when it comes to supervision, you actually need to define what your target or your label is. For example, in credit underwriting, one needs to define what good versus bad credit is. And if you also want to develop a machine learning model to estimate profit, you actually need to provide estimated profit for your models. And if attention is not paid to how that label is being defined, it could actually be in favor of white or males, and that could actually contribute to bias against our people of color. So in our comment letter, we actually call attention to how the label that is being used to train the model is defined or being specified. Next slide, please. Another risk is the risk of overfitting or irregularities in data that is used to train the model and the one that is used to evaluate the performance of the model. So you could imagine training an autonomous car to learn to drive only at night. when you deploy such model as such car during the daytime. So one could only imagine the number of casualties that will result from driving such a car during the daytime. So the same analogy actually extends to AI or machine learning models. So the common practice is that the data or the development data that is being used to build these AI or machine learning products and services are partitioned into test data, which is used to evaluate the performance of the model, and also train data, which is used to actually develop or train the model. And if there is a mismatch between the patterns that you have in the test data or the train data, one common result is that you have a model that performs very well on the training data and then underperforms on the test data. And we highlighted risks that are related to those overfitting issues in the comments later. Next slide, please. Now, like I mentioned earlier on, so the traditional focus when it comes to like risk related to even like statistical models is on the outcome. And one thing that we know is that if we really want to have a comprehensive view or understanding of the risk, we also need to pay attention to the outcome risk. And in the next 3 slides, I'm going to be talking about the risks that are related to outcomes that were actually raised or highlighted in the comment later. Next slide, please. So there are regulations or provisions or requirements for model developers or for financial institutions to deploy into production environment only models that actually pass some sanity checks. And some of them could be like, providing specific and accurate adverse action notices. Even if you have a model that actually tries to maintain the performance that you observed during training, you also see the same performance during testing. Like one still needs to check that the model is explainable. And one common analogy that I use is, we always say the best of humans is still human. The same thing applies to models. So the best of explainability techniques is still a model. So we called attention to, understanding the assumptions that are built into these explainability techniques, knowing fully well that if we want to remove bias from outcomes, or we want to assess whether variables are proxies or not, we need to really understand the assumptions that are built into the explainability techniques. Next slide, please. So another risk that is related to outcome risk is, the dynamic updating of the business environment. So when it comes to the environment where AI models or machine learning models are deployed, they change a lot. Even within a minute, you could actually have multiple changes in that environment. For example, if you think of people that are applying for mortgages, like this year, right? We don't expect, because a typical mortgage term is like 25, 30 years, right? We probably shouldn't expect those people to apply for mortgage in the coming years or even next year. So that means the patterns that are associated with people that are applying for mortgage this year are expected to be different from those that are going to apply for mortgage, let's say, in the subsequent years. So we called attention to a need for us to actually have an AI model that is adaptive or sensitive to the environment in which it is deployed. Next slide, please. Now, when it comes to the data that is actually used to train or test the model or even evaluate the performance of the model, so it is not uncommon to actually see changes in the prediction attributes, the predictions or the outcomes that is coming from the model, and the attributes or the features that are being used in the model. And traditionally, there are metrics that are being used for statistical models. And there are instances where some of these traditional metrics are not adequate for machine learning models. And we use the opportunity to actually highlight some of these gaps or deficiencies in the metrics that are being used or applied to traditional statistical models, and how they should actually be updated or revised if they're going to be used in machine learning or AI context. And I'll hand over the next slide to Karim, who will be talking or focusing on risks that are related to algorithm or model.
Thanks, Michael. And I will actually be turning over to my colleague, John Merrill, to address this next section. John, please go ahead.
So thank you. So far, Michael has talked about data risks and outcome risks in AI bias. I want to talk about model risks and about mitigation opportunities for those and other risks. It's easy to believe that unfairness in a classifier is always driven by lopsided sampling or its stability. That's not true. It's perfectly possible that an underwriting system built on a truly fair and accurate sample will in the end be unfair. I want to present an example of how that might happen and then talk about ways to mitigate this risk. Here's an example. I want to talk about underwriting for a strictly hypothetical lender. There's no example that I know of that's not true. Consider the problem of underwriting a loan, and suppose you have a fair sample of applicants, which represents and reflects the true distribution of applicants and their performance in a lending space. Now, lenders make more money on people who eventually wind up missing payments and pay penalties or face other increased sources of costs. People who pay on time are certainly profitable, but the truly profitable applicants are those who get behind and pay late fees and then catch up. Now, the likelihood of falling behind and having to pay a late fee is heavily influenced by the borrower's age. Young people are much more likely to miss payments and pay late fees than are older applicants. Simply put, older applicants are better credit risks, but they may not be more profitable. So suppose you're building an underwriting system for a lender. Next slide, please. And suppose you have a younger applicant and an older applicant. Which one will you choose? Obviously, the younger applicant. Next slide, please. Let's look at this in detail. Here we see a notional data set which captures late payment frequency by age. And here we see the simple idea of building an AI model using a naive profit maximization algorithm. The algorithm attempts to underwrite loans profitably. It simply picks approve, deny with the intention of maximizing overall profit for the loan book. Consider the expected amount of late fees over time. Higher fees lead to higher profit and hence to improvement. Lower fees typically tend to lead to lower profit. For equally risky borrowers then, we would rather pick the higher fee applicant. So here's the case for a younger applicant. One would expect them to have a higher rate of late or missing payments, and hence one might expect them to be more profitable. And thus you wouldn't expect them to be approved more likely relative to older borrowers of roughly comparable risk. Next slide, please. And here's the case for an older applicant. One would expect them to have a lower rate of late or missed payments, and hence one would expect them to be less profitable and thus approved less often relative to younger applicants, including the control group. So even though the data is not biased and the outcomes are correct, and the target is a central target for business, our hypothetical lender winds up with a discriminatory lending system. in which older borrowers are approved relatively less often than members of the control group, which are, in turn, approved relatively less often than younger applicants. Next slide, please. I want to touch on a key point here. I didn't specify what learning system was used, whether it was something as standard as a logistic regression or something as complicated as a monotonic global additive model. And though I focused on underwriting, I could equally well have focused on pricing. The problem here is generic. A naive construction of an underwriting function can not only perpetuate discrimination, but in some cases, even create it. Fortunately, there are sophisticated techniques for building AI models which are less likely to have disparate impact in the presence of any form of bias. Next slide, please. There are three classes of these: pre-processing transformations, in-processing transformations, and post-processing transformations. Pre-processing transformations change the input data. Michael talked about observer bias or sample bias. The goal of pre-processing algorithms and techniques is to automatically attempt to compensate for that kind of bias by changing the input data. In processing, consider the case of the lender above. Perhaps you could increase the number of applications coming from older applicants, either by sampling or by weighting, so that the difference in payoff between older and younger applicants is erased. The result would be a fairer classifier. Notice that the membership in the protected class is not part of the data presented as input to the classifier. The weights according to the training samples are changed, but not the training samples themselves. That's going to be a theme I'll repeat, that membership is needed during training, but not after deployment. In-processing techniques, which are focused on in this slide, change how the input data is used, changing the resulting model, AI model itself directly. For instance, our hypothetical lender could add an extra bit to the accuracy target during training to punish the model in some means for treating older applicants differently from younger applicants. And that way, the model would tend to learn to balance pure accuracy off against fairness. And the result is generally a fairer classifier. Again, though, note that the protected class membership is necessary during training, but not after tentative deployment. The punishment depends on membership in the protected class, but it does not change the actual input data, which means the protected class status will not be available during deployment. Next slide, please. Post-processing techniques change the output of the model. Sometimes we could do something as simple as change the decision threshold for a model score a little bit to add more members of a protected class relative to the number of members of a control class, or to remove more members of the control class relative to the number of members of the protected class. Either manipulation would, in general, result in a fairer outcome. Again, protected class is used during training and model selection to know how many protected class members were added or removed relative to the number of control class members. But it's not used after deployment. I raise this issue usage because there's a continuum of cases here. Changing the decision threshold is routine and widely accepted. Obviously, directly using predicted status or a proxy, therefore, during production is forbidden. But the methods used in pre-processing and in-processing techniques are neither as straightforward as changing a decision threshold, nor as forbidden as actually including the class data during deployment. This raises a complicated question where guidance will be necessary. What uses of protected class information are acceptable and what uses are not? And when are those uses allowed? We know that we can't guarantee that we will build fair classifiers with naive processing techniques completely unmoored from protected class status. So we will need guidance about how and how much protected class status should be used while building underwriting and pricing models. The pros and cons of these approaches in consumer finance should be studied. To summarize then, we've discussed the legal and regulatory landscape concerning disparate treatment and impact within which advanced AI models currently exist. We've discussed three sources of disparate impact: data risks, outcome risks, and model risks. And we've discussed mechanisms for mitigating those risks. At this point, I wish to hand the presentation over to Olga and Maureen to make recommendations and give calls to action. Thank you.
Thanks, John. And hi, everyone. My name is Olga Axelrod, she, her pronouns. I'm a senior staff attorney at the National ACLU's Racial Justice Program, where we've been focusing quite a bit on algorithmic bias, particularly in areas of housing, employment, and credit. And, you know, we really believe that what you've been hearing about today are core civil rights issues that really requires some major regulatory action by the finance agencies, and, you know, really a similar commitment by the federal government and by agencies enforcing other civil rights laws. So turning to the recommendations, I think it's just important to note here that while we've given you quite a bit of technical information in this presentation on the problem of algorithmic bias and some of the ways to handle it, and the RFI response gets pretty dense and pretty technical in some areas, we were really careful to not endorse or recommend adoption of any one particular technological response to the problem. And instead, our recommendations really focus on what are the necessary elements of a framework for the agencies to conduct regulation. So that's what these recommendations are really about. So the first one, non-discrimination and equity, this is harking back to what Steve talked about at the very beginning of the presentation. And really here, it's about redefining model risk to include concerns about non-discrimination and equity. So the risks that a model can pose are something that banks and other financial institutions currently have to have clear, robust processes for managing. But the federal guidance currently defines those risks as about risks to the financial institutions, such as financial loss or a hit to the reputation of the institution. And we're really asking that this definition be redefined to include impact on the consumers themselves more generally, and the risks of discriminatory or inequitable outcomes specifically. And that's really key, because what is considered to be model risk really defines the focus and the priorities of the financial institution's internal oversight. And we really need non-discrimination and equity to be seen as a core risk that the financial institutions need to address, as opposed to just an afterthought. The next recommendation is an action plan. I think that one sort of speaks for itself. We're really just asking agencies to develop and publish a plan that will lay out really concrete steps that the agencies will be taking, steps such as proposing a robust regulatory framework, plans to issue new policy statements, examination guides, regulatory change, etc. Next on the slide is robust supervision and enforcement accountability. And here we are essentially asking the agencies to step it up. And that means really two things. One is that we're asking the agencies to conduct in-depth reviews of the use of models by financial institutions, and to really analyze in particular whether they have comprehensive systems for identifying and mitigating risks of discrimination and inequitable outcomes and are complying with fair lending laws. And secondly, to aggressively use all of their enforcement tools where they uncover weaknesses in those systems or violations of fair lending laws. And here, although the RFI response points to the need to set clear expectations for the actions that financial institutions need to take in order to ensure that their models are not discriminatory and are equitable, we also don't want the agencies to wait until those clearer policies are put into place to actually take enforcement action, because that could take some time and the harm is happening now. So we're really urging the agencies to use those enforcement powers right away. Next slide, please. So this slide covers actionable policies, and that covers really a wide range of policies that we're asking the agencies to put forward. We're really asking them to issue clearer policies that reflect a commitment to consumer protection and civil rights and fair lending laws, and to really clarify what specifically do these financial institutions, what should be doing, what are they expected to be doing, and what will these agencies be doing to ensure that the financial institutions are doing it. And all of these actionable policies are really within the framework of existing civil rights and fair lending laws, as Steve talked about at the start. And the financial institutions should already be doing them. But the agencies have to be more effective in ensuring compliance, even as these models and systems get more complex and riskier in the ways that Michael and John laid out. So what are we asking these policies to cover? The first is redefining model risk. So we've already talked about that one. Just making clear that discrimination and non-equitable outcomes are core risks that the financial institutions have to have clear systems to identify and to mitigate. We're also asking that they issue policies that really inform the financial institutions about the possible risks. And that's really spelling it out for the financial institutions, all those risks that Michael and John laid out for you. And what are the common problems that they really need to look out for and address. We're also asking the agencies to set really clear standards for the financial institutions in terms of internal testing, documentation, archiving, and explainability. And here, we're informed by a lot of different work, but I think the work of Deb Raji and Timnit Gebru and other experts who've written a lot about AI accountability and internal auditing and documenting, I think was very instructive. And so what we're talking about here are policies needing to be clear, that discrimination testing by financial institutions can't just be done after a model is deployed when it's already harming, or just at one stage of of the process, really to be effective and to mitigate the most harm, the assessment of the model's potential and actual discrimination needs to be happening during the model's conception, during its design, during its implementation, and again during its use. So it's a constant problem, a constant assessment, really from end to end of these models' creation and their uses. We're also asking for policies that really set out what needs to be documented by these financial institutions about their models and about their assessments of those models. So what testing have they conducted with respect to disparate impact? What less discriminatory alternatives have been considered? We want in-depth information regarding the data that was used to train the model, the measures taken to ensure the data was representative and accurate. What are the attributes being used in these models, and what is that target outcome? As John said, it's not just the data, it's also what is the model actually predicting? The bias can be built into that question. We also want to make sure that they are providing documentation on their adverse action notices and what they are using, what techniques are they using to reliably produce consistent and specific reasons that consumers can understand and respond to if needed. And here we've really asked the agencies to be clear that explainability standards need to be met even as the models get more complex. And if they can't explain the model, then they shouldn't be using it. We are also asking that these fair lending risk assessments be conducted by not the people designing the models, but by independent actors, either within the institution or by third parties that have that technical expertise, but that there's some separation between the design process and the assessment. Describe agency testing. We really want the agencies to be clear with the financial institutions and with the public as to what exactly they're going to be doing to provide a check on the institutions. And here, this is really laying out what is that in-depth analysis of the models and the process that financial institutions use to get to the models. We want the agencies to be testing for disparate impact. We want them to be testing for less discriminatory alternatives, really delving into whether that training data was representative and accurate, what that model is measuring, how it's doing it, and really ensuring explainability. And then the final point here, before I turn it over to Maureen, is just ensuring transparency. This is really critical. We're asking that the policies that the agencies issue be clear that to the fullest extent possible, we want public release of the information about the models that the financial institutions are using, their risk assessments of those models, and the agency's own assessments. And certainly there will be some limitations in terms of what can be released, but as much as possible, we need to have that transparency to have this be a real check on what they're doing. So I'll turn it over to Maureen for a description of some additional recommendations.
Great. Thanks, Olga, and thanks everyone for joining us today. We're in the home stretch. You all are doing great. This is some complicated stuff, and we really appreciate you tuning in to learn more about this. So I'm going to finish up with some of the recommendations, and then right after that, we're going to go into a Q&A session. So if you do have questions for any of the panelists, and if you have the question, somebody else probably has the same question. So go ahead and use the Q&A button that's at the bottom of the Zoom, or sometimes it's under the More section. But you can click on that Q&A and submit a question. So to finish up with the recommendations, the next recommendation has to do with public research. And here the agencies really have vast resources with respect to public research. So we are urging the agencies to either conduct their own research and provide that information publicly, to partner with academics or civil rights organizations, or to fund the research. And in addition, we're urging the agencies to please share as much data as possible so that independent advocates such as yourselves can also conduct their own research. The next recommendation has to do with staffing. So we're urging the agencies to staff up immediately with specialized fair lending and AI experts. We think this is important for a number of reasons. For example, this will help the agencies effectively conduct examinations, also to review models or to construct their own models, and then also to provide clear and concise guidance to industry and advocates. The next recommendation has to do with training. And so here we are urging the agencies to require training for the key AI stakeholders, and that would include the agencies themselves, as well as financial institutions and tech companies. And we think that trained professionals are much better able to spot the red flags. So what we're concerned about is being able to spot the issues that might lead to potentially discriminatory or inequitable outcomes. And that's also related to our next recommendation. So next slide, please. Our next recommendation has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And here we're urging the agencies as well as the financial institutions to staff up with diverse teams that they recruit, retain, and develop. Research has shown that diverse teams are more profitable, more innovative, and more productive. And more important for us, we feel that they are better able to spot the red flags. So again, as with training, we feel that they're more able to identify the potential issues that could lead to discriminatory outcomes. So for example, we know with facial recognition, it was actually a Black researcher on the team that was able to identify that the facial recognition would not work for her, although it did work for her colleagues. So things like that lead us to urge the agencies to train up their staff as well as to recruit diverse teams. The next recommendation has to do with transparency. So with respect to transparency, first, we are asking the agencies to be as transparent as possible in the data, in the models, and in the proposals that they're considering related to AI. So that we hope that all of us here on the phone then can actually understand what they are proposing to do, what the agencies are proposing to do, and help them avoid any unintentional and adverse consequences. With respect to transparency, we're also urging the agencies to require financial institutions to release as much information as possible, and that would include the data, the models, the financial institution's own self-assessment, and even just letting consumers know that they are being evaluated using artificial intelligence models. And then the last recommendation has to do with what Olga just mentioned in terms of engagement. So we do applaud the agencies for opening up the RFI to the public. It was great to have the opportunity to comment on this. We are urging the agencies to stay engaged with diverse stakeholders. Ultimately, we believe that by working together, we can seek solutions that will treat all consumers fairly, and will seek fairer solutions with respect to artificial intelligence. Next slide, please. So that finishes up our recommendations. Hopefully that gave you a good sense of all of the AI risks that we have highlighted, and then the recommendations that we are putting in the letter for the agencies. And so now we're getting to the call to action, which is the whole point of this webinar, is to share with you the link to the Google Doc, which the advocates put together as the response. After this webinar, we will be sharing the slides, so you'll have a PDF of the slides with all of these links, and the original invite that you had also should have all of these links. So first, there will be the link that contains the advocate response. A number of our organizations work together on this, and so we think it provides a robust and comprehensive response. The organizations include the National Fair Housing Alliance, Fair Play AI, the ACLU, the Lawyers Committee, the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, Upturn, AI Blind Spot, SpinReg Lab, the Tech Equity Collaborative, BLBS, and Relman Colfax. And so hopefully I mentioned everybody. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. And then, of course, the big call to action is that we really hope that you will sign on to the letter. And if your organization is interested in signing on, then please use the link to the Google form and fill out the Google form by Wednesday, June 30th. And if along the way you have any questions, then please feel free to reach out to me or any of the panelists here. Our information for all of the panelists is on the last slide. And again, the slides will be sent around after the presentation. So now we're going to move to the Q&A portion. And thanks to those of you who have already submitted questions. So the first question, I believe, is for Steve. And Steve, the question we have is, what can we expect as next steps from the agencies?
So I'm not entirely sure. It's a hard thing to predict what they'll do with this, but the agencies have been in a learning mode for some time on these issues. I think it's nice to see that they're coming together to address them. And I think probably we'll see both a coordinated response from some of the agencies, and then we'll see individual agencies do their own thing. And so, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if they took this opportunity to update what's called the FFIEC exam manual procedures to insert some things that have to do with AI specific issues. I think that that manual is probably due for an overhaul generally, so we might see that. I think probably in the short term, we're more likely to see policy statements or guidance from individual agencies like the CFPB that talk about their specific approaches in these areas. And so I would love to see, and I think that it's quite possible we'll see some guidance from the CFPB, for example, talking more specifically about the COA and the discrimination risk related to AI ML.
Great, thanks, Steve. The next question we have, it looks like it's for Michael. So Michael, the question is, what possible roles can missing data play in AI bias? Michael?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Maureen. So when it comes to missing data, I remember during, when we're talking about AI risks, especially focusing on data risk, right? The fact that we have people of color, or let's say other races that are underrepresented in the data, that actually points to having missing patterns that are actually different from what you have in your development data compared to what you see in the production environment. And like Olga mentioned, especially talking about like documentation and all that. So if the patterns are not well documented and you are not monitoring what is actually going on in the production environment, so it's really possible that when what you see missing in the production environment is different, then that can actually worsen or deteriorate the model in such a way that could actually hurt the population you're trying to serve.
That's great. Thanks, Michael. Olga, we have a question that I think is for you, a two-part question. So how much expertise do we think the agencies currently have in AI and tech? And what do we think it will take for them to be able to gain the expertise they need to truly be able to provide oversight in this area? Olga?
Well, I can start out by answering this, but I think Steve might have some more firsthand information about sort of what's going on inside the agencies. But we have seen quite a bit of informal blogs, etc., from the CFPB, for example, over the years. We haven't necessarily agreed with the tenor of it, but it does seem like the agencies do have some basic understanding that some of these issues are happening, but just have not actually had the proper response for how to deal with it or the proper centering of civil rights. I think what it will take is certainly increase staffing up. We have asked that the agencies do quite a bit of in-depth review, which takes staff and staff with expertise. So I think that absolutely has to happen. I'm hearing that my volume may not be up enough. Can I get a thumbs up or down if people can hear me? Up? Yes? Can you hear me? Okay. So I think that certainly staffing up is going to be important, and making sure that their staff are properly trained, and that their staff are trained in sort of making sure to understand that there's this intersection of understanding the technical risks, but also through a fair lending perspective. And, you know, I also think it does call for, you know, increased commitment by the federal government in general. We have seen, you know, the executive order on racial equity from the Biden administration, and sort of a call for a whole of government approach. But I think that there's some concern, at least on the part of some of the organizations, us and some of the other organizations we're partnering with, that, you know, that priority of racial equity and protection of other protected classes hasn't necessarily been married very clearly with AI policy and the policy on technology. And we really need to make sure that there's you know, that there are clear marching orders to these agencies to do some of the stuff that we've asked them to do.
Great, Olga, thank you. Steve, do you want to follow up on the question on agency expertise? If not, I do have another question for you.
Oh yeah, I think that Olga's response was great. I don't have anything to add. Okay, in that case, we had a question about privacy, which is not the focus of the letter, but it makes sense that folks would have a question about what does the letter say about privacy and protecting consumers' data? It's a great question, and it's a very important issue. And I know a lot of folks on the call, and especially ACLU, this is really something that they've focused a lot on. The specific question in the RFI that we're responding to is really about models and AI. Obviously, that deals with data quite heavily, and so we do talk about data, but the focus of the response is not on privacy necessarily. It's more about how those models interact. And so there's very little discussion actually of the FCRA or other privacy mechanisms in this letter, because it's responding to the specific requests in the request for information. So the short answer is the letter actually says very little about privacy. The longer answer is privacy concerns are quite serious and real, and that's a larger initiative that a lot of the groups on the call, and I know others are pushing for and trying to marry up as well.
I do, just to add to that, want to mention that there is a brief discussion of it in a section where we talk about alternative data, because, you know, there are different kinds of alternative data, and certainly the use of traditional data has led to quite a bit of bias in credit scoring, and there's at least some forms of alternative data that have been put forth as something that can really help reduce the bias. But there's different kinds of traditional data, and I think from the ACLU's perspective and what's kind of talked about in this letter, that you know, the kinds of data that consumers themselves actually have control over is going to be the best kind of data, because it's going to be data that they can actually sort of affirmatively allow to be used, such as bank flow data. And it's going to be more accurate. So when you start getting into alternative data, such as, you know, social media data, things like that, you're really getting into the realm of some really serious issues with privacy and accuracy at the same time. So that's something that is briefly discussed in the letter, but it wasn't necessarily the focus of what this RFI was.
That's great. Thanks, Steve and Olga. And just a reminder, if you want to submit a question for the panelists, there is a button at the bottom of the Zoom that's labeled Q&A. You can just click on that and submit the question. So the next question is for Michael. And the question is, what are possible blind spots of AI explainability techniques? Michael?
Yeah, thanks for your question, Maureen. When it comes, there are a lot of explainability techniques out there. And like Olga mentioned, like our focus is not to make any recommendation that this is the technique that should be used or not used. But what we know is that any technique that is being used to explain the AI or machine learning models, they are models themselves. So which means they come with assumptions. So, and there are standards that need to be followed, right, when it comes to explaining the model. But even if those standards are met, it's still important to check the underlying assumptions for each of those explainability techniques. And that's one of the things that we actually highlighted in the section of the letter that focuses on explainability.
Great, thanks, Michael. The next question is a question for you, Olga. It's a little bit similar to the question we had for Steve, but it's along the lines of kind of next steps. The question is, do we have a sense of the agency's current appetite for regulation in this area? Olga?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I might need to punt again to Steve somewhat, but I think it certainly is. We hope that it's a new day, right? We have a new administration. Under the prior administration, the CFPB issued some disconcerting posts that we talk about in the letter that really sort of talked about a little more of a hands-off approach and ways that financial institutions could sort of get around some of the current existing standards, such as adverse action notices. And so we're hoping that this RFI signals a willingness and an interest in increased regulation. There's currently an Office of Management and Budget memo that was actually issued under the prior administration in November for the requiring the agencies to sort of do a assessment of what kind of regulation they're going to be doing and could be doing. And we have concerns, frankly, that OMB came under the prior administration, as I mentioned. The focus of that memo is really to develop AI and to support the development of AI. There's mention in there of civil rights, but it is absolutely not the focus and not the priority of what the OMB issued. And the new administration has not rescinded it. So the agencies are still working under that guidance. So that is a real concern. And I think that this RFI response shouldn't be the only thing that we do. It is, I think it contains a lot of really important recommendations in it, but I think that we absolutely have to push these agencies and the administration in many ways in collaboration with each other as civil rights and technology organizations, et cetera, to make sure that that the interests of innovation and development of AI don't mean that we've got like a civil rights free zone, right? That the civil rights laws are still enforced. And I think it's going to take a lot for us to make that happen. Steve, I don't know if you had, or anybody else, I don't know if you have anything to add.
No, I completely agree with that. I would say that there's a range in terms of regulatory action that the agencies can take. And the agencies also have, as folks know, split jurisdiction. And so the CFPB has rulemaking authority over ACOA, which is the primary discrimination law that would be applicable. None of these agencies have rulemaking authority over the Fair Housing Act that's held by HUD, who's not technically part of this. I think that there's probably an appetite for the CFPB to rethink how Reg B deals with some of the treats some of the explainability issues that we've talked about. There might be less of an appetite to do a full notice and comment rulemaking on some of the discrimination issues. I think probably it's more likely that CFPB comes out with other softer forms of regulation in the sense of explaining what it will do in supervision and exams, maybe changing its exam manual to reflect that. That's both because it's faster and easier for the CFPB to do that. And actually for counterintuitively, it might be a little bit more insulated as well for the CFPB to do that rather than to go through a full notice and comment rule. And I can talk more about why that's true, but that makes me think that there would be probably some regulation in the sense of regulatory action in this space. Whether that's a full-blown notice and comment rule, that seems less likely to me. But I think there's an appetite for some action. I think people realize that this is important and they want to prioritize it.
That's great. Thanks, Steve and Olga. So we had a couple other questions that I think I can address real quick. So we had a question about, will the comment letter be available to draw on in our own comment letters? And we very much support if there are parts that you want to lift and amplify. We very much support that. We welcome any sort of support. We're not so worried about the authorship, but getting the message out. So if you're not comfortable signing on, but there are some parts that you would like to amplify in your own comment letter, please feel free to do that. We also had a question about would we consider a shorter summary letter? So what we tried to do is take the recommendations, mostly what Olga and I were talking about at the end, and then provide an executive summary at the beginning. So hopefully that's helpful, and that gets to the areas that the organizations might be the most concerned about. So I guess one way of thinking about it is if the middle section on the really technical parts seems a little bit inaccessible, just know that we are not recommending any particular technology approach. So hopefully that gives you some comfort that by signing on, you're not saying that a certain type of technology should be advanced. What you're really signing on for is the recommendations section. And of course, if you have any questions on the recommendations or any other part of it, please feel free to contact us. We have another question that's kind of similar, Steve, to what you said before, but let me frame it the way this person framed it. And they said, is there more that we could say about how receptive and knowledgeable the agencies are with regard to these specific recommendations? Steve?
There's probably a variation by the recommendation. I think some of them they'd be quite supportive of, and it's important in a letter like this to see that this is an ask from a broad range of advocacy groups, because I think some of these recommendations are the types of things that some staff in the agencies would like to do anyway. So to play a more robust role in supervision, to really push on, for example, looking for less discriminatory alternatives and thinking about data representativeness. And if there's a letter that's a concerted letter from a broad group of advocacy groups, it's easier for those staff to then feel empowered internally to say, yes, this is the direction we're going in. And I think that that's all quite likely. Whether there will be, for example, public audits of private models, I think something like that, transparency about private models is less likely, but it's important. And I don't know exactly what will come up. So with respect to any recommendation, if people have, I can kind of make a prediction about how likely I think that is. And there's a huge range. Some of the recommendations I think are likely, especially if it's clear that there's some support for them.
We have another question that came in that I think, Olga, is for you, although I'm going to provide a little bit of context at the beginning. So we have a question about accountability. And what role do we think the CFPB's, the Bureau's responsible business conduct bulletin will have in helping drive financial institutions to be more transparent with regulators and business partners in explaining how their models and algorithms operate? And Olga, before I turn it over to you, the other thing I would want to emphasize is the responsible conduct bulletin is from the CFPB and the CFPB alone. But there is something called the Uniform Consumer Compliance Ratings, and that applies to all of the regulated financial institutions. And so that means that the other regulators also would hold the financial institutions to those standards. And as part of those standards, the financial institutions need to show that they have compliance management systems for key risks. And I think we would argue, and I think everyone on this phone would agree, that artificial intelligence, especially to the extent it can impact communities of color, would be a key risk, and that the financial institutions would be expected under the rating system to show at least an adequate, if not strong, compliance management system to control for that risk. So I'll repeat the question again, Olga, for you. The question is about the CFPB's Responsible Business Conduct Bulletin and the extent to which it could incent or help drive financial institutions to be more transparent. Olga?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure what I have to add to what you've already said, Maureen, which is that, you know, a key part of our recommendations is to make sure that risk of discrimination is actually part of model risk, and therefore part of what these compliance management systems have to cover. And that we're asking the agencies to include very specific specific things in what has to be documented, right? So it's not going to be just like, oh, trust us, we did some testing. We want that to be documented, and we want, we've specifically asked that, for example, that data be archived such as is necessary for the agencies to actually redo the testing, right? So if you're not archiving what you've done with regards to training the model, for example, then later on, no one is going to be able to really assess how well you've done with that. So it's going to come down to the agencies really getting into the nitty-gritty of exactly like what do those documenting standards actually require them to archive. But what we've laid out is what we think are the core elements of that, which is, you know, document what kind of testing you did, document what the less discriminatory alternatives you tested for are, you know, archive the data, really do in-depth documenting about the data, about the outcomes and the attributes. And all of that is meant to allow for both the agency to assess, but to the extent that we can get some of that public, it's going to mean that consumers are going to be able to have more of an understanding of what's happening with these. But obviously this stuff is super technical and most people aren't going to be able to do anything with it. But there is a huge cadre of experts out there, researchers who are really focusing on things like AI ethics and accountability. And to the extent that we can get this information into their hands through public transparency, then we're really going to be able to have much more robust supervision, not just by the agencies, but also by researchers, et cetera, that can also be a check. So as much transparency as possible is critical. I don't know if anybody else has anything else to add.
That's great, Olga. Thank you so much. Steve, we have a question that I think we can start with you, and if others want to jump in. So it's kind of framing things the other way, which is, shouldn't the default be, or why can't we just say that no financial institution can use a model unless it's proven to be 100% bias or discrimination free? Why can't we just use that as the standard?
It's a good question. I think probably the answer is that given our existing financial system, that's probably not something that we could ever fully accomplish, that any lender would ever be able to fully accomplish, given how deeply embedded structural racism is and how that's reflected in all of these decisions. And so that's a standard that would be very difficult to meet, and not one that I think we would have much success persuading these agencies on. I do think that the more effective route is the one proposed in this letter, which is a recognition about how deeply embedded all those problems are, and then an imperative to work constantly to address those and improve the situation. And so it's, I think probably, maybe there's an argument for pushing there. Right now, that feels like probably an impossible standard given our country's history to me. But it's an interesting thing. I would love to talk more about that with others.
Thank you, Steve. And John, would you like to weigh in on this as well?
Yes, thank you. It's also important to realize that sometimes forcing fairness on one group may actually impede fairness on another group. There's interactions between different groups. To carry on the example I used before, women tend to be better creditors, better debtors than men. So depending on the age distribution against the gender distribution of your applicant pool, it may not be possible to achieve fairness for both groups simultaneously. So I completely agree that it would be great to be able to be fair for all people and applicants. But I do think it's important to realize that that may not even be possible, even were the data sets fair and complete.
That's great. Thank you, John. So a quick reminder, we just have a couple minutes left. If you have a question, please use the Q&A function. And also a quick reminder that after this, we will send around the PDF of the slides. And so if you have any questions, our contact information is on there. And then also there will be the link to the Google form for sign-on. So Steve, we have a couple questions that came in that are very specific about what is or is not in the letter. So we can start off with you. Does the letter advocate for eliminating credit scores? Steve?
No, it doesn't. It doesn't go that far. And that's probably sort of akin to the question that we just had before. I mean, the idea of using some information to make predictions about future performance and using that in the financial services is so embedded. And I think that there's interesting conversations about the pros and cons of that type of approach. But the letter essentially assumes some continued form of that, and then says, as that system is evolving and developing, we need to have strict guidelines around it to address this. And frankly, I'll say a lot of the questions that we're talking about here with respect to AI, ML models are also true for historic traditional models. A lot of the questions are very similar. And this is actually a moment now where we can push on some of these issues that should have been corrected decades ago, frankly, with respect to traditional models. And I know that a lot of groups on the call here have been fighting that fight, have been talking about historic discrimination being embedded in traditional models. And this is a new opportunity to push back on some of these core principles.
Thanks, Steve. And Olga, I think we have a question for you. It's similar to several points that you've touched on, but if you could say a little bit more, the question is, does the letter advocate for public audits and complete transparency into the financial institution's use of models? Olga?
Yeah, so this is something that we debated about a little bit internally, about sort of what is the structure. We knew that just an internal audit was not going to be enough because there has to be a check on that. And so then the question is, what is the check? Is the check the agencies themselves doing an audit, or is the check some sort of other body doing an audit? what we have right now, you think about, for example, because this AI is happening in all sorts of contexts, right? And you think about what's happening right now in the hiring context, where you also have AI systems. There's been recently a lot of talk about audits in that context, because you have these tech companies out there making these claims about they're 100% bias free and we're super tested. We've done all the testing, we're great. And then they will have an independent company do something that they're calling an audit, but there's no standards for what an audit is, right? And it means completely different things according to what the auditing company is. And so it's meaningless, basically. And so we debated quite a bit about, is it that we want the agencies to do the audit, or is it that we want the agencies to make really, really clear standards about what an audit means, so that when a company says we've been audited, it actually means the same thing, and doesn't just depend on what the auditing company thinks it means. We ended up really focusing on agencies themselves doing the audit, and that the agencies' audits would be made public as opposed to separate standards, in part just because of the experience of some of the people in the team who really felt like some of the models of agencies setting standards and then relying on others to implement those standards haven't worked as well in practice, and that when the agencies themselves do the audits, it's more robust. But I think absolutely there has to be a check. It has to be very clear as to what that check is, and it has to be made public. Maureen, I don't know if you want to speak more towards that that trade-off of agencies themselves doing the audits versus setting standards for others.
That was great. Thanks, Olga. I think that was a very complete answer. The only thing I'll say is that, it is the agency's responsibility to conduct a thorough examination and to identify risks and to help an institution get on track. They're supposed to issue what they call matters requiring attention if they see weaknesses in the financial institution's approach. As part of the model risk management, of course, also, even from a safety and soundness perspective, there's an emphasis on independence, so that whoever is doing the check, whether it's called an audit or review or exam, it should be somebody who sort of didn't have any skin in the game in developing it and is objective in terms of understanding what the risk is and providing some guidance on that. And again, going back to what Olga said at the top of the hour, which was that risk should be defined to include the risk of discriminatory or inequitable outcomes. So I think in terms of agency versus financial institution approach, what we're hoping for is that the agencies will provide some guidance on what their expectations are, and that those expectations will be reasonable and robust enough to protect communities of color and other protected groups. So hopefully that gives all of your organizations enough to work with in terms of thinking about whether you want to sign on to the letter. Even if you don't want to sign on, we welcome any questions. The more we can all learn about this is definitely the wave of the future. This is now, this is happening now, and it will continue to proliferate. So we're happy to engage in conversation, and please feel free to contact any of the panelists if you have any questions. So thank you so much for your time. Thanks to the panelists, and thanks to the captioner and Madeline McBride for keeping us going behind the scenes. Thanks, everyone.